The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was fitting, because Tuesdays in Redemption Creek, Texas were generally the worst day of the week, and what Aaron Ellsworth read in those 3 tight lines of ink was the worst news he'd received in some time. He had been standing at the post window of the general store when old Hector Timms slid the envelope across the worn counter without ceremony, the way a man passes off something he'd rather not be holding. Aaron had looked at the return address, Caldwell, Kansas, his Uncle Roy's cramped handwriting, and had felt nothing particular about it yet. Letters from Uncle Roy usually contained news about cattle prices or the occasional complaint about bad weather. They did not usually make Aaron's jaw tighten the way this one did. He had read it twice in the shade of the store's front porch, the dry August heat of 1883 pressing down on his shoulders like a flat iron. The letter was short. Uncle Roy had never been a man for elaboration. "Aaron," it read, "your cousin James is dead. Fever took him 3 weeks past. His widow, Etta Dalton, she kept her name. You'll understand why when you meet her is alone on the property with their 2 young ones, Thomas, who is 7, and me, who is 4. Nobody around here will go near the place any more. She's run off every neighbor and every hand I've sent to check on her. 3 words, Aaron, difficult, fierce, impossible. I would go myself, but my hip won't allow the ride. The land is good land and James loved her. God only knows why. Somebody needs to get out there before winter. I leave it to you." Aaron had folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He had stood there for a long moment looking out at the main street of Redemption Creek, at the horses tied to the hitching rails and the dust lifting in little spirals near the livery stable entrance, and he had thought about James, who had been 2 years older than him and who had taught him to play cards, and once, memorably, talked him out of a fight with a man twice his size behind the cattleman's saloon in Abilene. James was dead. Aaron had walked directly to the livery stable without stopping at his own house, without eating the supper he'd been planning, without doing any of the half-dozen things he'd meant to do before the week was out. He had saddled Calamity, his best horse, a big sorrel gelding with a white blaze down his nose and enough stamina to run the legs off anything else in the county, and he had ridden out before sundown. He did not stop in the way that a man stops when he is only going somewhere. He stopped when the horse needed water, and when dark came down so completely that even Calamity could not navigate safely, and those were the only stops he made. He pushed hard through the better part of 2 days, sleeping 2 hours at a stretch in his bedroll with his saddle as a pillow, eating hard biscuits he'd grabbed from the tin on his kitchen shelf, without even thinking about whether there was anything else to pack. The landscape rolled out around him as he rode north, the dry scrub grass giving way to the broader plains, the sky enormous and indifferent, the occasional cottonwood standing alone beside a creek bed like a man who'd been abandoned at a party. He passed through 2 small towns and did not stop in either. He crossed the Red River at a shallow ford where the water came up to Calamity's belly, and the horse went through without complaint. He was in Kansas by the end of the 2nd day, which was faster than he'd intended and only possible because Calamity was, in Aaron's private estimation, the finest horse in the state of Texas and possibly in the world. He found the Dalton property James's property. He corrected himself, or Etta's property now, on a Wednesday afternoon when the sun was 3 hours past its peak, and the light had turned that particular shade of golden that made even hard country look like a painting. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise above a shallow creek, a solid 2-story structure that James had evidently built with care. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that was doing better than Aaron would have expected, and a split-rail fence that needed 1 new section on the east side but was otherwise in fine shape. Aaron rode Calamity down the track toward the house and was 50 yards out when he heard the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. He stopped immediately, hands rising to a neutral position, because Aaron Ellsworth had not survived 31 years on the frontier by being slow to read a situation. "That's far enough," said a woman's voice from the direction of the porch, and it was not a voice that held any uncertainty in it. It was a voice that had made a decision before he had even arrived and was simply informing him of it. "My name is Aaron Ellsworth," he said, keeping his voice level. "James's cousin. I've ridden from Redemption Creek." There was a silence. Not an empty silence, but a thinking silence, the kind a person makes when they are deciding something. "James never mentioned a cousin Aaron," the voice said. "James mentioned plenty of things he didn't put in letters," Aaron replied. "He taught me to play 5-card stud when I was 16. He bet me I couldn't ride Old Ponderosa for 10 seconds and I rode him for 12, and he never paid me the $1 he owed me. He had a scar on his left hand from a fence wire accident when we were boys, and he always put too much salt in his coffee and too little in his food." Another silence. Then the sound of boots on porch boards coming down the steps, and Aaron kept his hands where they were and did not move. She came around the side of the fence post with the rifle still pointed at him, and Aaron's first thought was that Uncle Roy had significantly undersold the situation. Not the part about difficult, not the part about fierce, but the part that the letter hadn't said at all, which was that Etta Dalton was a woman who looked like she'd been made by someone who understood what the land required of a person and had built her accordingly. She was not tall, but she stood like she was. Her hair was dark and practical, pinned up away from a face that was all clear angles and brown eyes that were doing an extraordinarily thorough job of measuring him right now. She wore a plain work dress and boots, and she held the rifle with the ease of a person who had been holding rifles since before it was considered ladylike. She was, Aaron estimated, somewhere around 26 or 27. The rifle did not waver. "He did put too much salt in his coffee," she said, "and the rifle came down, though not all the way." "I know," Aaron said. "I'm sorry about James, he was a good man." Something moved across her face at that, brief and private, and then it was gone. "Get down off your horse," she said, slowly, "and don't reach for anything." Aaron climbed down from Calamity slowly, because he had been asked to, and because he was not a man who saw anything to be gained from defying a reasonable instruction from a woman holding a rifle. He tied Calamity to the fence post near the water trough and turned to face her with his hands open at his sides. "Roy sent you," she said. It was not a question. "Roy sent a letter," Aaron said. "I made the decision myself." She looked at him for a long moment. The brown eyes had a quality to them he couldn't quite name yet, something that was both sharper than he expected and older than her years. "What makes you think I need anything?" she said. "Your east fence needs a new rail," he said, because it was true and because he thought honesty might serve him better than any other approach with this particular woman. She blinked. It was the first thing he'd said that had surprised her. "It does," she said carefully. "I can fix it," he said, "before I go." "Before you go," she repeated. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Aaron said. "I'm not here to tell you what to do. James was my cousin and he's dead, and his uncle asked me to come check on his family. That's the whole of it." Etta Dalton looked at him for a long, long moment in that golden afternoon light, and then she put the rifle over her shoulder and said, "There's coffee inside. It's real coffee, not that chicory mixture, so don't complain about it." "I wouldn't dare," Aaron said, and he thought he saw something flicker at the corner of her mouth that might, in a different light, have been called the beginning of a smile. He met Thomas and me at supper that evening. Thomas was a solemn-faced boy with his mother's direct gaze and his father's coloring, and me was a small whirlwind of 4-year-old energy, who had decorated the kitchen table with a collection of interesting rocks before Aaron sat down, and showed no intention of removing them. Etta had made a stew that was considerably better than anything Aaron had eaten on the road, and they sat around the table in a careful, watchful sort of quiet that had a dozen different things running underneath it, none of which were being said. Thomas looked up from his bowl after a while. "Did you really know my father?" "Since we were boys," Aaron said. "He was a good deal bigger than me back then. He used to chase me around the barn with a feed bucket. He said this last part seriously, as though it were a point of some importance. Thomas almost smiled. Me did smile, openly and completely, because she was 4 and had not yet learned to be careful about it. Etta was watching Aaron from across the table with the expression of a woman who was cataloging information. He could feel it like a light pressure, that gaze, and he did not mind it. He had nothing to hide. He ate his stew and answered Thomas's questions about James honestly, and did not try to make the dead man into a legend, just a person, because he thought that was what the boy needed more than a legend right now. After supper, when the children were in bed, Etta poured them both a second cup of coffee and sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and the rifle was leaning against the wall near the door, present but not in hand, which Aaron counted as progress. "Roy told you I was difficult," she said. "Roy told me 3 words," Aaron said. "Difficult, fierce, impossible." She was quiet for a moment. "He sent 4 men before you," she said. "2 of them tried to tell me I needed to sell the land. One of them thought he could make decisions about my children without being asked. The 4th one was genuinely well-meaning, but talked so much I couldn't hear myself think for 2 days." "I see," Aaron said. "Do you?" "You ran them off," he said. "Every one," she said, and there was no apology in it, and he did not expect one. "Good," he said. That surprised her. He could see it in the slight shift of her posture, the way her coffee cup paused before reaching her lips. "Good. A woman alone with 2 children and a working property in Kansas in the middle of a drought year doesn't need men coming in and telling her what she already knows," Aaron said. "She needs the east fence fixed and probably someone to split the rest of that wood I saw stacked by the barn before winter. Those are things I can do. After that, whether I stay or go is entirely your call." Etta set her coffee cup down. She looked at him with those careful brown eyes, and something in them shifted slightly, like a door that had been bolted from the inside just barely, just fractionally, easing on its hinges. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "There's a decent cot in the tack room." "Thank you," Aaron said. "Don't thank me," she said. "The last man who thanked me overconfidently ended up walking back to Caldwell in the dark." Aaron nodded seriously. "I'll thank you with appropriate caution, then." This time the corner of her mouth definitely moved. "Go to bed, Aaron Ellsworth," she said. "The east fence won't fix itself." He slept in the tack room that night on a narrow cot that smelled pleasantly of hay and old leather, and he lay in the dark for a while listening to the quiet of the Kansas night, which was a different quiet than the Texas quiet he was used to, and he thought about James. He thought about the fact that James had loved this woman. This particular woman with the rifle and the precise gaze and the coffee she didn't apologize for, and he thought that was, all things considered, an entirely sensible thing to have done. In the morning he fixed the east fence. He found the replacement rails in the barn, already cut, as though James had known it would need doing, and he set to work as the sun came up, and Etta came out of the house with a cup of coffee for herself and none for him, which he found reasonable since she had no particular reason yet to bring him coffee. He worked steadily and got the section done by mid-morning, and had moved on to splitting the wood pile by the time she came out to tell him there was breakfast going. "You work fast," she said, looking at the fence. "I grew up on a working ranch," he said. "It sticks with you." She looked at the wood pile, half of which he'd already gotten through. "James used to say you were the most stubborn person he'd ever met," she said, and there was something warm in her voice when she said James's name, something she didn't try to hide, and he liked her better for it. "He was right," Aaron said. "Runs in the family." She almost laughed at that. Not quite, but almost, and he counted it. They fell into a pattern over the following days that neither of them planned and neither of them commented on, because naming a thing too early can sometimes break it. Aaron worked from sunup to sundown. The fence, the wood, then a section of the barn roof that was developing an ambitious lean toward the ground, then the chicken coop door that had lost its hinge. He ate meals with the family and answered Thomas's questions, and let me show him her rock collection with appropriate seriousness. He did not try to make decisions. He did not offer opinions unless they were requested. He stayed in the tack room, and he did not overstay his welcome, and he kept his own counsel about things that were none of his business. Etta watched all of this. She was a woman who watched carefully, and he knew it, and he did nothing different because of it. He was simply himself, which was the only strategy that had ever worked for him and the only one he had any skill at. It was on the 5th day that she started talking. He was working on a section of the pasture fence on the far side of the property, and she appeared with 2 tin cups of coffee, just appeared, as though she had been going to come out this direction anyway and happened to have 2 cups. He took his without comment, and they stood looking out at the pasture for a while in a comfortable enough silence. "James knew this land was good," she said eventually. "He said it before we even moved here, said the soil in this valley was better than anything he'd seen in 3 states. He had an eye for it," Aaron said. "He did." She was quiet again. "He didn't have an eye for how sick he was getting. By the time either of us understood what the fever was doing, it had already been 3 weeks. Aaron did not say he was sorry again, because he had already said it once, and she was not a woman who needed to be told things twice. He just stood there and let her say it into the air between them, because sometimes that was the thing a person needed. "People around here think I'm unfriendly," she said. "I know. I'm not unfriendly," she said. "I'm particular." "There's a difference," he agreed. "There's a significant difference," she said, and looked at him sideways, and he looked back at her, and somewhere in the middle of that brief exchange something shifted between them, quiet and small, and neither one of them ready to name it yet. "Thomas likes you," she said, turning back to the pasture. "He's a good boy," Aaron said. "He's James's boy," she said, "through and through. The way he thinks about things, careful, thorough." She paused. "He doesn't talk about James to me. He thinks he needs to protect me from it." "He's 7, Aaron said gently. "He shouldn't be protecting anyone at 7, she said, and there was a fierceness in it that he recognized now as the thing that made her who she was, the refusal to let the people she loved carry things they shouldn't have to carry. He should just be 7. Aaron thought about that for a moment. "I'll talk to him," he said. She looked at him then directly, the full weight of those brown eyes. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she took her coffee and walked back toward the house without saying anything else, and Aaron finished his fence post and thought that being wanted somewhere, even quietly, even provisionally, was a thing he had not felt in some time. That evening, after supper, he asked Thomas if he wanted to see something, and the boy agreed with the careful seriousness he applied to everything, and they went out to the barn. Aaron showed him how to do a proper check of a horse's hooves, which he had taught himself when he was not much older than Thomas, and while they worked he talked about James. Not the big things, the small things. The way James used to whistle off-key and think he was in tune. The time he'd bet his good hat on a horse race and the horse had stopped in the middle of the track to eat grass and James had walked home hatless and pretending it didn't bother him. Thomas listened. Then, after a while, he started talking too. Slowly at first, and then more steadily, the way water finds its way through when you make even the smallest opening. He talked about his father teaching him to fish in the creek. He talked about a morning when James had made hot cakes and burned every single one, and they'd eat them anyway and laughed. He talked with the particular intensity of a child who has been holding a weight and has finally found a place it is safe to set it down. Aaron listened to all of it. He did not try to fix anything. He just listened. When they came back in from the barn, Etta was in the kitchen, and Thomas went to her and she put her arms around him and looked at Aaron over the boy's head with an expression Aaron did not have adequate words for. It was gratitude, and it was something more complicated than gratitude, something that had to do with being seen and with being surprised by it. He went to bed in the tack room and lay awake longer than usual, staring up at the dark. On the 7th day, the Alderman brothers came. Aaron heard the horses before he saw them, 2 men on good horses coming in from the north at a pace that was not hurried but had intent in it. He straightened up from the water pump he'd been working on and stood in the yard as they rode in, and he read the situation with the instinct he'd had since boyhood, the one that told him when something was coming that was going to require his full attention. Wade Alderman was the older one, somewhere in his early 40s, with the look of a man who had always had just enough more than his neighbors to believe it was his natural due. His brother Curtis was younger and follower, the kind of man who got his confidence secondhand from whichever direction his brother pointed. They stopped their horses in the yard and looked around with the proprietary ease of men who had been here before and expected the same reception they'd received then. Etta came out of the house before they had even dismounted. She stood on the porch with no rifle this time, but Aaron noticed she had positioned herself close to the door, and he thought the rifle was probably just inside it. "Mrs. Dalton," Wade Alderman said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to be both polite and dismissive at the same time. "Came to talk again about the property." "I've said everything there is to say about the property," Etta said. "Now we've made a fair offer," Wade said, in the patient tone of a man who has decided patience is a better tool than force for the moment. "A more than fair offer given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Etta said, "being that my husband recently died and you think I might be more persuadable on account of it." Wade's mouth tightened slightly. "I meant the circumstance of a woman alone managing a property this size." "I'm not alone," Etta said. And then Aaron walked forward, not quickly, not aggressively, just steadily, into the middle of the yard where both Alderman brothers could see him clearly. Wade looked at him with the calculating assessment of a man rereading a situation. Curtis looked at him with something closer to unease. Aaron was taller than both of them and had the build of a man who had been doing physical work his entire life, and he stood in the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and a pleasantly neutral expression on his face. "This is Aaron Ellsworth," Etta said from the porch. "He's family." There was a brief silence in which Wade recalibrated. "We weren't aware you had family in the area," he said to Etta, not to Aaron. "There are a number of things you aren't aware of," Etta said, "including the fact that I have spoken to the land office in Caldwell about this property and my legal standing is entirely clear. I am not selling. I was not selling last month and I am not selling now. The next time you ride onto this property uninvited, I'll consider it trespassing and treat it accordingly." Wade looked at Aaron for a long moment. Aaron looked back at him with the same neutral expression. Then Wade touched his hat brim again, this time without the dismissiveness, and turned his horse. Curtis followed without speaking. Aaron watched them ride back up the north track until they were past the far fence line. He turned back to the house. Etta was still on the porch, and she had let out a breath she'd been holding, and her hands, he noticed, had been clenched at her sides. "They've come 4 times, she said. "I know the type," Aaron said. "They think the land will be easier to get if they wait long enough," she said. "They might be right in general," he said. "They are wrong in your particular case." She looked at him. "How can you be certain?" "Because difficult and fierce means you don't wear down," he said. "It means you hold." She stared at him for a moment, and he saw something in her face that was very nearly undone, just for a second, just the thinnest line of something soft and tired beneath the part she showed the world. It was there, and then it wasn't. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and went back to the water pump. He finished the water pump by midday and started on the garden fence by afternoon. Because the deer had been at the squash, and the vegetable garden was one of the main sources of winter food for the family, and the existing fence wasn't doing its job. Me helped him by handing him nails with tremendous seriousness, offering each one with both hands the way a person presents something important. "That's the nail," she would say. "That is indeed the nail," Aaron would confirm and drive it in. This ritual made me extremely satisfied. She narrated the entire process to nobody in particular, explaining to the chickens and the surrounding air exactly what Aaron was doing and why it was necessary, and Aaron listened to this narration with genuine enjoyment. He was aware of Etta watching from the garden, where she was tending the last of the summer vegetables with the kind of focused attention she gave to everything. He was aware of her in the way that he had been increasingly aware of her over the past several days, a low constant warmth like a banked fire, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is simply there, always there, and the room is colder without it. He did not examine this too closely. He was here because James had asked through Roy, and because it was the right thing to do, and he was not a man who complicated the right thing with his own wants. Not yet, anyway. That evening after supper, when the children were in bed, Etta came out to the porch and sat in the chair she favored, which was the one on the left side of the door where she could see both approaches to the house. Aaron was sitting on the porch steps, which had become the unofficial end-of-day position for both of them, and the night was coming in cool and full of stars, which in Kansas in late August was something to see. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Before Redemption Creek." "All over," he said. "I worked for a cattle outfit out of Abilene for 4 years, then a ranch in the Panhandle, then I ended up in Redemption Creek 3 years ago. Bought a small spread there. Nothing like this." He looked out at the dark shape of her land. "Nothing this good." "James said the same thing," she said, "about the land." "He had good taste," Aaron said. She was quiet for a moment. "He had very good taste," she said, and he thought she was not talking about land anymore, or not only about land, and he looked at the stars and did not say anything. She continued more quietly. "We weren't the match, was not what people expected. My father thought I should marry someone from town, a merchant or a banker, someone with more certainty in his future." She paused. "James had a dream and a piece of land and a considerable amount of stubbornness. My father called it reckless." "Looks like a solid future from where I'm sitting," Aaron said. "It is," she said simply. "It was, it will be." She said this last part with the particular determination of someone who has decided something. "I'm going to keep this place. I'm going to run it properly, and I'm going to raise Thomas and me here, and I'm going to make it exactly what James believed it could be." "I believe you," Aaron said. "Most people don't," she said. "Most people haven't spent a week watching you work," he said. She looked at him then in the starlight, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen from her before. Not guarded, not assessing, just looking the way a person looks at something that has genuinely caught them off guard in a good way. "Why are you still here?" she asked. Not hostile, genuine. "You fixed everything that needed fixing." He considered the honest answer to this question because it was the only kind of answer he was capable of giving her, and because she was the kind of woman who would see through anything else. "I'm not entirely sure," he said, "but I don't feel finished." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she looked back at the stars. "The winter is going to be hard," she said. "The summer was dry and the winter is going to be hard." "I know," he said. "I don't need anyone to take care of me," she said, and there was no defense in it, just information. "I know that too," he said. "But," she said and stopped. "But," he said gently. "But it's been a long time since someone sat on this porch with me," she said, "and I hadn't realized how long until right now." Aaron felt the warmth of that statement settle somewhere deep in his chest, careful and quiet, and he did not rush it. He just sat with it the way you sit with something that matters. "Well," he said, "I'm in no particular hurry." She said nothing to that, but she did not go inside either. They sat on the porch until the late summer stars were spread overhead in their full abundance, and the land was dark and quiet around them, and it was a good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need anything put into it. After that night, something loosened between them that had been held tight by the necessary carefulness of strangers. Not quickly. Nothing about Etta Dalton happened quickly. He was learning, and he found this admirable rather than frustrating, because a woman who had survived what she had survived had every right to be deliberate. But it loosened steadily, the way a good knot loosens under patient attention rather than force. She started talking to him differently. Not with the guardedness, the careful monitoring of information. With the ease of someone who has decided another person can be trusted with the unedited version. She told him about growing up in Missouri with a father who'd had specific and uncompromising ideas about what women were for, and how she'd had equally specific and uncompromising ideas in return, which had not made for peace at the supper table. She told him about meeting James at a dance in Kansas City, how he had been the only man there who had asked her opinion about something other than whether she would like more punch. She told him about the first 2 years on the farm, the years before Thomas was born, the sheer physical work of it, the way she'd surprised even herself with what she was capable of. He listened to all of it. And she listened to him in return, which was something he hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for, being listened to by someone who was actually interested, who asked questions that went deeper than the surface of things. He told her about the years with the cattle outfit, the particular loneliness of that life, beautiful and free and lonelier than almost anything he'd known. He told her about the spread in Redemption Creek, which was modest but his, and what it had meant to have a place that was his. He told her very carefully about a woman he'd nearly married 3 years ago, a woman named Clara who had been entirely lovely and entirely wrong for him, though he had not understood this at the time, and they had parted on decent enough terms, and she had married a hardware merchant in San Antonio the following year. "Were you heartbroken?" Etta asked. "I was relieved," he said, which told me everything I needed to know about whether I'd been in love. She thought about that. "Love doesn't feel like relief," she said, not asking, saying. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't feel like relief at all." A pause, careful and full of things, he stayed. 2 weeks became 3, and 3 became 4, and he helped her bring in what was left of the harvest and put it up for winter, worked the barn into proper shape for the cold, repaired the chimney mortar in the kitchen where it had been developing a dangerous gap. He was useful in concrete ways, which was the only way he knew how to be. He was not trying to make himself indispensable. He was simply doing what was in front of him. Thomas had started coming to find him in the mornings to help with the outdoor chores, which had developed into something Aaron recognized as the particular bond that forms between a boy and a man when neither of them makes it a project, when it just grows from shared work and shared quiet, and the occasional story told at the right moment. He taught Thomas to handle Calamity properly, who was a patient horse with a child and infinitely preferable to the Dalton horses for the purpose, and Thomas took to it with the careful seriousness he took to everything, and within 2 weeks had graduated to actual riding lessons in the paddock while me sat on the fence and announced the proceedings to anyone who would listen. Etta watched these things with the same careful attention she gave everything. He could see her softening, and he did not press on it, because he understood instinctively that pressing was the wrong instrument for this particular situation. He was, by nature, a patient man. He had waited out cattle drives in bad weather, and the long particular patience of building something from the ground up, and he could wait now too. One evening in late September, the night turned sharp and cold for the first time in a way that said winter meant it. Aaron had been banking the barn fire and checking that the animals were properly settled, and when he walked out of the barn, Etta was standing in the yard looking up at the sky, which had gone very clear and very cold and very full of stars. She had a shawl around her shoulders, not enough for the temperature, and she was just standing there with her face turned up. He went and stood beside her, not too close. The right distance, and he looked up too. "James used to say," she said very quietly, "that there was more sky in Kansas than anywhere else in the world." "He was right," Aaron said. "He was right about a lot of things," she said. "I know." "I miss him," she said simply, without pretense. "I know," he said again. "So do I." She turned to look at him then in the cold starlight, and he looked back at her, and the distance between them was the right distance, and then, without either of them choosing it, it was a slightly different distance, and her hand was in his. Just her fingers, cool from the night air, against his palm. He folded his hand around hers gently, carefully, as he would hold anything that mattered. They stood like that for a while, looking up at the Kansas sky, with the cold coming down around them and the barn warm behind them and the house lit up in the near distance where Thomas and me were sleeping. And Aaron thought, with a clarity that surprised him only in how unsurprising it actually was, that he had ridden up here from Texas 2 weeks ago thinking he was doing a duty, and had discovered instead something that did not feel like duty at all, something that felt like arriving somewhere. He did not say this. He simply stood in the dark and held her hand. It was the following week when she kissed him, or more precisely, when they kissed, because it was mutual and simultaneous in the way of things that have been building long enough that when they finally happen, they happen all at once without there being a clear initiator. They had been arguing. This surprised him, or would have, if he had not already learned that Etta argued with the same directness she brought to everything else, and that arguing with her was, in its way, one of the more enjoyable things he'd done in recent memory. The argument was about the North pasture. She wanted to try wheat next season, and he thought the soil profile was better suited to corn, and they had both laid out their positions with complete conviction, standing in the kitchen with the table between them and their voices not raised but very firm. He had said something, he couldn't even remember what it was exactly, some point about drainage and soil moisture, and she had looked at him with those fierce, direct eyes, and she had said, "You are the most infuriating man I have encountered in my entire life." And then she had come around the table and kissed him. It was not tentative. Nothing about Etta Dalton was tentative. It was a kiss given with the full conviction of a woman who had made a decision and acted on it. And Aaron, who was not a tentative man himself, kissed her back with equal conviction. And for a long moment the North pasture and the wheat and the corn were entirely beside the point. When they stepped back from each other, both breathing slightly differently than before, she looked at him with an expression that was complicated and clear at the same time, the way her expressions often were. "That was not entirely planned," she said. "No," he agreed. "I need you to understand something," she said. "This land, my children, those come first. They will always come first. Any man in my life has to understand that." "I understand it," he said. "I'd think considerably less of you if they didn't." She studied him. "You would, wouldn't you?" she said, not quite a question. "Without any doubt," he said. She nodded slowly. "The North pasture," she said. "I still think wheat." He thought about it. "Tell me your reasoning," he said. "I may have been looking at the wrong part of the field." She told him her reasoning. It was, he admitted to himself, persuasive. They argued about it for another 20 minutes with great enjoyment, and by the end had arrived at a compromise that was probably better than either of their original positions, which Aaron found privately thrilling in the way that only things are thrilling when you have met your genuine equal. October came in hard and beautiful. The prairie turned the particular colors of autumn on the plains, the grass going gold and amber, the cottonwoods along the creek dropping their leaves in drifts, the sky going that deep, relentless blue that is only possible when the summer heat has finally gone entirely. Aaron rode out to check the fence lines on the far property and came back to find Etta and me in the kitchen making apple preserves, the whole house smelling of cinnamon and cooked fruit in the way that turned a house into something that felt alive. Me had gotten apple juice on both her hands and most of her apron, and was extremely satisfied about this. She showed Aaron her hands as evidence of her work, and he told her they were the most apple-covered hands he had seen in recent memory, which she appeared to consider a compliment. He washed up and helped Etta lift the heavy preserve jars, and she led him without making it a point, which he appreciated. The ease with which she received help when it was offered naturally, without it being made into a statement about her capabilities, was something he'd noticed and counted among the many things he was learning to love about her. That word. He turned it over privately, carefully. Love. He had not arrived here looking for it. He had arrived here on a duty ride, on a sorrel horse and an uncle's letter and a dead cousin's memory, and he had found it waiting in the yard with a rifle and dark eyes and a spine that didn't know how to bend. He hadn't told her yet. It was too soon, maybe. Or not too soon, maybe. He was not quite sure where the line was with Etta, because Etta was a new kind of territory and he was still learning its map. The Alderman brothers came back on a Wednesday in mid-October, and this time there were 3 of them, Wade and Curtis, and a man Aaron didn't know who was wider than either alderman and wore his hat pulled low. Aaron was in the barn when he heard the horses, and he came out to find Etta standing in the yard again, and this time she did have the rifle held loose at her side. He walked to stand beside her and could feel the tension in her, controlled and held, the way a wire is held before it breaks. "I told you not to come back," she said to Wade. "We've been patient, Mrs. Dalton," Wade said, and his voice had changed, had dropped the pretense of reasonableness. "There are other ways to settle this." "Are there?" Etta said. "The land isn't registered the way you think it is," Wade said. "We've had a man in Caldwell looking at the records." Aaron's eyes narrowed. This was a different kind of play than the previous visits. This was a threat with legal clothing on, and those were the more dangerous kind. "Whatever claim you think you have," Aaron said, his voice calm and even, "I suggest you make it through the proper channels in daylight with a proper attorney present. Because if you try to make it in any other way, that will be the last decision you make in this county." Wade looked at him with the flat, measured look of a man deciding. The third man, the wide one, was watching Aaron's hands. "Who exactly are you?" Wade said. "Aaron Ellsworth," he said. "James Dalton's family, which makes this family's business my business." "You're not from around here," Wade said. "No," Aaron said. "I'm not. Which means I have no interest in your local politics and no patience for the particular kind of pressure you're applying. If you have a legitimate legal claim, file it. If you don't, ride away and stay away." There was a long moment. Then Wade touched his hat brim, the old dismissive gesture, and turned his horse, and the other two followed. Aaron watched them all the way to the fence line and over it. He turned to Etta. "We need to go to Caldwell," he said, "to the land office as soon as possible." "I've already been," she said. "We need to go again," he said, "together, with the original deeds and anything James left in writing. Whatever they're looking for in the records, I want us to get there first." She looked at him for a moment. "You know land law," she said. "Enough of it," he said. "I've had to." "Then let's go to Caldwell," she said, and there was something fierce and decided in her face that made him want to tell her right then, right in the yard, what he felt. He didn't, because the Alderman brothers had just ridden off and the practical matter was urgent. But he looked at her for a moment too long before he turned back to the barn to saddle Calamity, and when he glanced back, she was watching him with an expression she didn't quite put away fast enough, an expression that said she knew something was in his face and had filed it carefully for later consideration. They rode to Caldwell the next day, leaving Thomas and me with the neighboring widow, Mrs. Hennessy, who was a stout, capable woman who had apparently decided some weeks ago that Etta Dalton deserved better neighbors, and had been quietly demonstrating this by appearing with baked goods and a willingness to help. She greeted Aaron with the frank assessment of a woman who has known enough people to read them quickly, and seemed to conclude something positive about him, though she kept it to herself. Caldwell in the fall of 1883 was a town in the middle of its own transition, the cattle trade days fading as the railheads moved and the farming population grew. The land office was a tight room with a serious clerk named Morrison, who had the air of a man who took the immovability of paper records as a personal virtue. Aaron laid out the deeds and the marriage certificate and the documents James had filed, and Morrison went through the records with the patience of someone who knew exactly where everything was and was going to take exactly as long as it took to confirm it. What they found was that Wade Alderman had submitted a competing claim based on a disputed survey line from 7 years prior, before James had settled the property. The original survey had been imprecise, and the Alderman claim depended on a reading of that survey that put the fence line a quarter-mile east of where it currently stood, which would put the farmhouse itself inside the disputed territory. "It's not valid," Aaron said, looking at the survey and the subsequent filing James had made. James had this resurveyed in 1880. The Caldwell County Survey of Records supersedes the original. The Alderman claim is based on an outdated document that was officially revised. Morrison looked at him. "You've done this before," he said. "A version of it," Aaron said. "I've seen this kind of claim before." They go looking for old surveys and hope the current owner hasn't got their paperwork in order. He looked at Etta. Your paperwork is in perfect order. James was thorough, she said quietly. He was, Aaron said. He protected this for you even when he didn't know he needed to. Something moved in her face at that, brief and full. She pressed her lips together for a moment and then turned back to Morrison. What do I need to do to prevent this claim from being formally filed against me? Morrison walked them through the procedure, and by the end of the afternoon they had submitted a formal defense of record that would make any alderman filing demonstrably frivolous. And Aaron had written a letter to the county surveyor requesting a formal confirmation of the 1880 survey boundaries, and they had a copy of everything stamped and witnessed. They rode back toward the farm in the late afternoon, and the light was going gold and long across the Kansas plain, and Etta rode beside him with her posture straight and her chin up the way it always was. But she was also quieter than usual in the way that means something rather than nothing. Thank you, she said after they'd been riding for a while. James did the work, Aaron said. I just knew how to read it. You rode to Caldwell with me, she said. You stood in that office with me. You knew what to look for. She paused. You didn't have to be here for any of this. I know, he said. Aaron, she said, and he heard something in the way she said his name that he hadn't heard before, a quality to it, a kind of opening. He looked at her. I know you came here because Roy asked, she said. And I know you stayed because James was your cousin and you felt responsible. But I'm asking you now honestly, is that still why you're here? The light was full and golden around them, the horses walking easy, the land spread out in all directions, and he looked at her, at this woman who asked difficult questions directly and expected honest answers, and he said, No, that's not why I'm here anymore. She held his gaze. Then why? Because I don't want to be anywhere else, he said. Because this land and these children and you, and specifically you, Etta, are where I want to be. That is the honest answer. She was quiet for a long moment, looking forward between her horse's ears, and then she said, That is a very considerable thing to say. I know it is, he said. I mean it as a considerable thing. Another silence, the horses walking, the light going warmer. I am not easy to be with, she said. I know, he said. I've noticed. And I don't, she stopped, started again. I love James. I will always have loved James. Whatever this is, whatever this becomes, it doesn't erase that. It shouldn't, he said. And it doesn't ask you to. She looked at him again, and this time the look was different. It was softer in a way that did not take anything away from her, did not make her smaller or more uncertain, just added another layer to her, the way something gains depth when you see more of it. I am not going to pretend I haven't been thinking about this, she said. About you. About what it would mean. I haven't been pretending either, he said. The children, she said. Thomas and me come first, he said. I said it before and I mean it. Whatever I am to you, whatever space I occupy, theirs comes first. She nodded slowly. You understand that this land is mine, she said. Not in a way that excludes partnership. In a way that means this is my place and my work and my decision. I understand it completely, he said. I'd have it no other way. The farm came into view on its rise above the creek. The house lit up in the late afternoon light, and they rode in together, and there was something different about the air between them, something that had been said and was now simply there, solid and real, the way things are when they've moved from hope to fact. He stayed through October and into November. The farm took on the shape of a place that was properly prepared for winter, all the gaps closed and the stores laid in and the animals settled. Thomas had become, with absolutely no fanfare, an accomplished horseman for his age, and me had graduated from nails to holding boards while Aaron cut and was very serious about the responsibility. The evenings on the porch had moved inside as the temperature dropped, to the kitchen table with cups of coffee and the lamp burning, and the conversation that happened there was the conversation of two people who are finding out everything about each other and finding each thing worth knowing. He told her about his father, a good but distant man who had expressed affection through work rather than words, and had left Aaron with a perhaps excessive tendency to do the same. She told him about her mother, who had died when Etta was 12, and the particular loneliness of growing up with a father who had not known what to do with a daughter after that, and had defaulted to rules and expectations. They told each other the things that people tell each other when they decide to actually let another person in, which is always a matter of decision, and both of them were people who, once they made a decision, kept it. He kissed her properly for the first time on a night in early November, standing in the kitchen after the children were in bed, with the stove warm and the lamp casting everything amber. It was not a surprised kiss, not rushed. It was deliberate, the way he'd come to understand she preferred things, and she kissed him back with the full directness that was simply her, and when they stepped apart they were both smiling, which felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I think," she said, "that you should write to Roy." "Write to Roy," he said. "Tell him that his report of my situation was inaccurate," she said, "and that I no longer require checking on." "But," he said, because there was very clearly a but in her voice. "But," she said, and the corner of her mouth did the thing he loved, the thing it did when she was about to say something that cost her something, but she was going to say it anyway. "You should also tell him that you are staying for the winter, if you want to." "Etta," he said. "If you want to," she said again. "I want to," he said. She nodded briskly in the manner of a woman who has presented a proposal and received the answer she was prepared for and can now proceed. "Good. I'll have Thomas help me set up the spare room properly. You can't sleep in the tack room all winter." "I don't mind the tack room," he said. "I mind it," she said, which was the closest she was going to come that evening to saying what she meant, and he understood it completely and said nothing further about the tack room. He wrote to Roy. He also wrote to the man who was watching his spread in Redemption Creek, a reliable older hand named Garrett, telling him the situation and asking him to continue managing the property through the winter. He wrote the letter with the clarity of a man who knows what he is choosing and has made peace with the choosing of it. Roy's response came 3 weeks later. It was, in Roy's fashion, brief. It said, "Well, I'll be. She must have finally met her match. Take care of those children, Aaron. And tell Etta I am sorry for being an old fool in my previous letter." Aaron showed Etta the letter. She read it twice, and then she said, "He called himself an old fool. That is the most accurate thing Roy has ever written." But she was smiling when she said it. The winter came down properly in December, the snow arriving and staying, the plains going white and silent in the way that plains do, which is with a totality that is either peaceful or terrifying depending on how well prepared you are. The Dalton farm was as well prepared as a farm could be, and Aaron found that winter in Kansas had its own rhythms, its own beauty, the way the cold kept to the outside, and the inside of the house had a particular warmth that was the warmth of people who have chosen to be in the same place. Christmas came with a smallness and a richness that was particular to the frontier, where the celebration was not about abundance, but about what you made with what you had. Etta made a pine garland from branches Aaron had cut from the grove south of the creek, and me decorated it with ribbons saved from the dry goods order. And Thomas, who had been secretly working on something in the barn for 2 weeks with Aaron's help, produced a carved wooden horse for me that was the finest thing he had ever made, and reduced her to an unusual silence of pure joy. Aaron had ridden to Caldwell a week before Christmas, and had come back with coffee, real coffee, the good kind, and a length of dark blue wool fabric that was the exact color of Etta's eyes in certain lights, and 2 books for Thomas, who had James's love of reading. He had set these things under the pine garland with a simplicity that did not make a show of them, and when Etta saw the wool fabric she had touched it with her fingers and looked at him with an expression that told him he had gotten it exactly right. She had made him a pair of gloves. She had done it in the evenings after the children were in bed, and he had known about it because he was not unobservant, and the leather was the same as the leather in the tack room. But he had not said anything, and when she handed them to him on Christmas morning, he put them on, and they fit perfectly, which meant she had been paying exact attention to his hands for some time, and that seemed to him one of the most intimate things anyone had done for him. New Year's 1884 came in with a cold so deep the snow squeaked underfoot, and the horse's breath came in clouds. Aaron and Etta stood on the porch with their cups of something warm and watched the year turn, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him in a way that was so natural it was like she had always done it, like there had never been a time when she hadn't. "Last year at this time," she said, "James had been gone for 4 months and I didn't know how I was going to manage the spring planting. And now," he said. "Now I have a plan for the spring planting," she said, "and someone irritating to argue with about it. The wheat," he said, "wheat in the north pasture," she said. "It is the right call." "It very well might be," he said, which was the closest he had gotten to conceding it, and she made a small triumphant sound that he found entirely endearing. He kissed her temple, there on the porch in the frozen New Year's dark, and she tilted her face up to him, and he kissed her properly, and the year began the way he wanted it to continue, which was like this in this place with this particular woman. January and February were hard months on the plains in the way that they are hard on the plains, which is mercilessly, without apology. Aaron and Etta worked through them with the rhythm of two people who have learned to work together, and that rhythm was something Aaron had not known was possible to have with another person, the kind where you don't have to say most things because the other person has already anticipated them and is either already doing the thing or has a reason not to that she will explain when asked. He asked her to marry him in February, on a Wednesday, which was fitting because the first time he'd seen her had been, effectively, on a Tuesday, and Wednesdays were better than Tuesdays, and he had a sense that this Wednesday was going to be the best Wednesday he'd ever had. He did not make it elaborate. Etta was not a woman who wanted elaborate. He asked her in the kitchen after supper with the children present, because she had told him once that if her life was going to change, Thomas and me were part of that change and should know about it. He had thought about this carefully and had concluded she was right. He stood up from the table and looked at her and said, "I'd like to ask you to marry me, Etta. I'd like to build a life here with you and Thomas and me. I know what you're bringing to this, your land, your work, your children, your particular and excellent stubbornness, and I'm not asking you to change any of it. I'm asking you to let me be here for all of it, for good." The kitchen was very quiet. Me was looking between the two adults with the intense focus of a child who understands that something important is happening. Thomas was very still in his chair, watching his mother's face. Etta looked at Aaron for a long moment, with those clear brown eyes that had been measuring him since the first second they'd laid eyes on him, and then she said, "Yes." Me immediately and loudly announced that there would be a wedding, as though she were informing a crowd of several hundred. Thomas stood up and came around the table and hugged Aaron with the uncomplicated directness of a boy who has made up his mind about something and is done deliberating, and Aaron hugged him back. This solemn, careful boy who was James's boy and Etta's boy, and who had, somewhere in the last several months, become a boy that Aaron would readily have called his own. Etta was standing in the kitchen with wet eyes and a straight spine, which was exactly as Aaron had expected her, and he went to her and took her hands, and she said, very quietly just for him, "James would have liked you. I think he already did." "I think so too," Aaron said. They married in April, when the Kansas spring had come in with all its particular glory, the grass going green, the creek running full and clear, the sky, that enormous Kansas sky, doing its finest work in pale blue with high white clouds. The ceremony was at the little church in Caldwell, not a large gathering but a real one. Roy made the trip, moving slowly on his bad hip but arriving with his Sunday hat and a pride he was too old to conceal, and Mrs. Hennessy was there with her husband, and Morrison from the land office came because Etta had invited him, and he had seemed genuinely pleased about it. And Thomas stood very straight as the boy of the family, and me sat beside him, and was solemn for the first 30 seconds, and then began whispering her own narration of events to the nearest adult, who happened to be Roy. Etta wore the dark blue wool fabric as the trim on her best dress, and she was, in the April light of the church door, the most beautiful thing Aaron had seen in all his 31 years of looking at the world, and he told her so quietly as they walked together to the front of the church, and she said, "You are going to make a fool of yourself with compliments, and I am going to allow it." And he laughed, and it was the right way to start a marriage. The words were spoken and the ring placed, a simple gold band that Aaron had ordered specially from the jeweler in Caldwell, plain and solid and meant to last. And Etta looked at it on her hand with an expression that was full of things he could not name exactly but did not need to, because he knew her by now. He knew what she looked like when she was feeling something deeply and holding it with care, which was this. Wade Alderman did not come to the wedding, obviously, but he had also not been seen near the Dalton farm since the land office trip, and Morrison had quietly indicated that the competing claim had been withdrawn rather than filed, which Aaron attributed to the Aldermans having concluded that the cost of a legal fight they would lose was not worth the land, particularly now that the farm had a man on it permanently. He did not say this to Etta, because she did not need a man on the property to secure her claim, and both of them knew it, and because the Aldermans had made their decision for legal reasons, not intimidation ones. But he was glad about it simply, without complication. Spring planting happened in April and May with the two of them working the land together, and Etta's wheat went into the north pasture, and Aaron's corn went into the south field, and they both grew with the generosity of good soil that has been properly prepared. And by July it was clear that Etta's north pasture wheat was going to be a fine crop, and Aaron told her so directly, and she received this information with the satisfaction of a woman who had known it and is glad to be acknowledged. "Told you," she said. "You told me," he said. "I usually do know," she said. "You usually do," he agreed, and she looked at him with the particular warmth she had for moments when he said something she expected, but was glad to hear anyway. The summer of 1884 was good, not without its difficulties. Nothing on the frontier was without difficulties, but good in the way that a life is good when it is built on things that are solid. Thomas turned 8 in June and received a real fishing rod, which he used to an extent that slightly alarmed the fish population of the local creek. Mee turned 5 in August and received a rag doll that she named, with the complete confidence of 5-year-old conviction, Aaron Jr. "That seems like an unusual name for a doll," Aaron said. "She is unusual," Mee explained. "That is very true," Aaron said, because Aaron Jr. did have a distinctive personality, having already been involved in several dramatic events including a near drowning in the wash basin and a complicated situation involving the chickens. Etta laughed at this exchange in the free way she had come to laugh, which was nothing like the careful not-quite smiles of their first weeks and everything like the person underneath those smiles, the person who had always been there waiting for a reason to come fully out. He loved her. He told her this regularly and specifically, not in large speeches but in the small direct ways that she appreciated, the way she appreciated concrete things over abstract ones. He told her when he saw her in the garden in the morning, standing in the particular light with her hands in the soil. He told her in the evenings when she was reading by the lamp and looked up at him with those eyes that had measured him once and now just looked. He told her after the arguments, which they still had and which he still enjoyed, and which still regularly ended in kissing, or in laughter, or in some combination of the two. She told him, too. She was not a woman who said it easily or often, which meant that when she said it, it landed with a weight that was exactly the right weight. She said it in the fall of 1884 when the harvest was in and they were sitting on the porch in the last of the warm weather, and she said simply, "I love you, Aaron." And he looked at her and said, "I know. I love you too." And they sat in the companionable quiet of two people who have arrived somewhere and intend to stay. In November of 1884, Etta told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen, direct as always, no preamble. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "Spring, I think, April or May." Aaron set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and whatever he felt in that moment was large enough that he didn't immediately have words for it, which was unusual for him. He got up from the table and went to her and put his hands on her face, gently, the way you touch something precious, and she looked at him with those eyes, and the corner of her mouth did the thing. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I've done this before, I know what I'm doing." "I know you do," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She covered his hand with hers there against her cheek. "I'm well," she said, softer. "I'm happy." He kissed her forehead. "So am I," he said. More than I knew how to expect. Thomas took the news with the careful consideration of an 8-year-old who is thinking about what it means. He asked several intelligent questions about logistics and sleeping arrangements, which Aaron and Etta answered seriously. Me took the news with the enthusiasm of a 5-year-old who has just been told she is getting a new project, and immediately began planning the new baby's name, involvement, and character, though the name list she compiled was extensive and changed daily. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was spent in the warmth of a house that had, in a year and a half, become exactly what a house should be, full of work and noise and children, and the smell of coffee, and the ongoing argument about what was going to be planted where in the spring, which had by now evolved far beyond wheat and corn into a general strategic philosophy of agriculture that Aaron and Etta refined and debated and ultimately agreed on together, which was the best part. Roy came for Christmas, making the trip on the train since his hip wouldn't allow the ride, and arrived with the satisfaction of a man who has been proved absolutely right about something, which was that the situation had worked out, though not in any of the ways he'd predicted. He sat by the kitchen stove and let me show him her rock collection, which had grown to an astonishing size, and he watched Aaron and Etta move around the kitchen together with the unconscious ease of people who know exactly where the other one is going, and he said to Aaron privately, in the barn on the second evening, "I sent you because I thought she needed help." "She didn't," Aaron said. "I know that now," Roy said. "What she needed was someone worth the trouble." Aaron thought about this. "She'd say the same about me," he said. Roy laughed, which he hadn't done much in recent years on account of the hip. "I imagine she would," he said. "James always said she was the most honest person he'd ever met." I see what he meant. James was spoken of openly in the house, which was something Aaron had been careful about from the beginning. He was Thomas's father and me's father, and a man who had loved Etta and been loved by her. And his absence was a real thing, and not one that needed to be papered over. His photograph was on the mantelpiece, and the children talked about him and Aaron talked about him, and Etta spoke of him with a love that had moved from grief into something quieter and more settled, a love that held its place without requiring anyone to pretend it was gone. Aaron found, to his own surprise and not to his discomfort, that he had loved James too, or come to love him more completely in his death than he had fully expressed in his life, the way cousins sometimes do. The farm, the children, this life, these were things James had built and Aaron was tending, and there was no jealousy in that, only a kind of gratitude for the man who had made this place worth keeping. May of 1885 arrived with the prairie in full bloom and the creek running high, and Daniel James Ellsworth was born on a warm afternoon with Mrs. Hennessy assisting, and Aaron pacing the length of the porch with a thoroughness that gave Thomas and me a detailed understanding of how long a porch was. When the sound of a new baby came from inside the house, Aaron stopped pacing, and Mrs. Hennessy appeared in the doorway and said, "A healthy boy. Mother is perfectly fine and would like you in here, please." Daniel James was small and loud and had, from the first moment Aaron held him, an expression of extreme seriousness that looked almost exactly like Thomas's. He had Etta's dark hair and Aaron's blue eyes, which Etta observed with a satisfaction that suggested she had been expecting something interesting and was pleased with the result. Thomas held his new half-brother with great care and the seriousness he brought to important things. Me held him with slightly less care but enormous enthusiasm and had to be monitored. She announced that his name was perfect and that she had suggested James herself, which was not strictly accurate since Aaron and Etta had decided it together. But me had a gift for retrospective contribution, and they let it stand. Aaron sat on the bed next to Etta that evening, with Daniel sleeping in his cradle and Thomas and me downstairs having supper with Mrs. Hennessy, and Etta leaned against his shoulder with the exhausted, full quality of someone who has done a very large thing and knows it. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like you," he said. "He looks like both of us," she said, which was the kind of statement that could only be made by two people who have looked at each other long enough to know what features belong to which face, and it was one of the best things he'd ever heard. He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and outside the window the May evening was coming in gold and soft, and the farm was there, the land James had loved and she had kept, and they were building together, and the creek was running bright in the last of the light. "I never thanked you," she said. "You've thanked me," he said. "Not properly," she said. "Not for all of it, for not being like the others, for not trying to take anything or change anything or tell me what I needed." "You knew what you needed," he said. "I knew what I needed," she agreed. "But I didn't know I needed you." A pause. "That's the part that surprised me." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You surprised me too," he said. "Considerably. Repeatedly." "I intend to continue doing so," she said. "I'm counting on it," he said. The years that followed were good years in the way that real life is good, which is not without hardship but with a foundation under it that makes the hardship bearable and the good times genuinely luminous. The wheat in the north pasture continued to prove Etta right, year after year, and Aaron continued to acknowledge it, year after year. And this was a source of great satisfaction to both of them, though for different reasons. The corn in the south field did excellently, and by 1886 the farm was producing enough surplus that they were selling at the Caldwell market regularly, and Etta had developed a reputation among the traders there for both the quality of her wheat and the decisiveness of her prices, which she did not negotiate below without compelling reason. Thomas grew into himself steadily and wonderfully, the careful boy becoming a thoughtful young man with his father's eye for the land and his mother's direct way of seeing. By the time he was 10, he was a genuine help on the farm, not in the token way of children helping, but in the real way of someone who understands what needs doing and does it. He and Aaron had the particular relationship of two people who came to love each other through the side door of shared work and shared time, without anything being forced or made ceremonial about it, and which was all the stronger for that. Me grew up with the personality of someone who had decided the world was interesting, and she was going to have opinions about all of it, which she expressed regularly and at length, with a charm that meant most people found this delightful rather than exhausting, though exhausting was also sometimes accurate. She adored Daniel with a fierce protectiveness that occasionally made Daniel feel that his older sister had adopted him, which was not far wrong. Daniel grew up to be, at 2, and then 3, and then 4, a person of strong feelings and great loyalty, and a laugh that started somewhere in his belly and came out absolutely enormous, which was the laugh of neither Aaron nor Etta, and seemed to be entirely his own invention, and which had the effect of making whoever was around him laugh too, so that the kitchen was regularly full of the sound of all of them laughing, and the cause had usually been Daniel. Roy came to visit twice a year. His hip was not getting better, but it was also not getting worse, and the train made the journey manageable, and he sat in the kitchen and drank the good coffee and argued pleasantly with Etta about farming methods, always losing, and sat on the porch with Aaron in the evenings, and was generally content in the way of an old man who has lived long enough to see something work out. In the summer of 1887, Etta told Aaron she was expecting again. She told him at the kitchen table, same as the first time, and this time he did not have any trouble with words. He simply reached across the table and took her hand and said, "Good," with a completeness that made her smile the full smile, the one that still made his chest do something complicated and glad. Their second child, born in February of 1888 in the deep cold of a Kansas winter, was a girl, and she arrived with her mother's dark eyes and a fury of expression that suggested she had opinions about the process that nobody had thought to ask her. They named her Lucy Rose, and me, at 8, considered this entirely satisfactory and immediately and permanently assumed the role of primary authority figure in Lucy's life, which Lucy eventually accepted on a case-by-case basis. The Alderman family, for what it was worth, had moved away from the county by 1886. Wade had gone into some business venture further west that hadn't worked out, by all accounts, and the farm north of the property had been sold to a family from Missouri who were, by the universal testimony of their neighbors, perfectly decent people who kept their fence lines on their own side. The land claim had never been filed and was never mentioned again. On a Thursday evening in September of 1888, 5 years from the late summer when Aaron had saddled Calamity and ridden north without stopping, he came in from the fields at the end of the day to find the kitchen full of the sound and smell of supper being made, Thomas setting the table with the efficiency of a 12-year-old who has done it 1,000 times, me narrating something to Daniel who was listening with devoted attention, and Lucy on the floor in the corner examining a wooden spoon with the focus of a scientist. Etta was at the stove, and she turned when she heard him come in, and she looked at him in that particular way she had, the full, clear look of a woman who sees exactly what is in front of her and has decided every day that what is in front of her is what she wants. He washed his hands and came to stand beside her, and she handed him a spoon to stir something without ceremony, which was the most domestic and the most intimate thing in the world, and he stirred it. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. "The East Field is going to be the best crop we've had." "I told you that 3 weeks ago," she said. "You did," he said. "You didn't believe me," she said. "I believed you 3 weeks ago," he said. "I just didn't say so." She turned to look at him with mock severity. "That is not the same as believing," she said. "It is exactly the same," he said. "It is not," she said. "I see we're back to this," Thomas said from the table with the world-weary tone of a 12-year-old who has witnessed this dynamic for his entire memorable life. "We never left it," Etta said. "We thrive on it," Aaron added. Me, who had been waiting for an opportunity, seized this moment to deliver a long editorial about the East Field's prospects that incorporated information from approximately 5 different conversations she had been part of or adjacent to in the last month. Daniel listened to this with open admiration. Lucy continued examining the spoon. Aaron looked at the kitchen, at all of it, at Etta turning back to the stove, with the corner of her mouth doing the thing he had loved from the first month he'd known her, at Thomas carefully filling the water glasses with the thoroughness that was purely James, at me holding court with the confidence that was purely Etta applied to different material, at Daniel's enormous laugh starting to build because something me had said had been funny even if nobody else had caught it yet, at Lucy in the corner adding the spoon to a collection of items she was apparently building into something. He had ridden from Redemption Creek in August of 1883 with a letter in his pocket that said difficult, fierce, impossible, and he had saddled his best horse and ridden without stopping because James had been his cousin and Roy had been worried, and it was the right thing to do. He had arrived to a rifle and brown eyes, and a fence that needed fixing, and a woman who had run off every man who'd come before him, because every man who'd come before him had tried to give her what she didn't need, and had failed to offer what she did. He had stayed because he had fallen in love on a farm in Kansas with a fierce and particular woman who had loved her husband and kept his land and raised his children and made her own decisions, and had, eventually, made the decision to let Aaron Ellsworth stand beside her. It was, in every way he understood the word, a life. A real one, made of hard work and good land and early mornings and long evenings and arguments that ended in laughter and children who were growing into people with their own ways of being in the world. It was not a life he had planned or searched for. It had found him, or he had found it, on a dusty track in Kansas when he'd ridden calamity through the August heat and arrived at a place that turned out to be exactly where he was supposed to be. Etta looked up from the stove and caught him looking, and she held his gaze for a moment with that expression he knew now, the one that said everything she didn't always put into words, and he held it back with everything he had. "The stew is ready," she said. "Good," he said. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you've been standing in a field thinking about something." "I have been," he said. "I've been thinking about how right you usually are." "That is," she said, setting the pot on the table with the confidence of a woman in her own kitchen, "the most accurate thing you've said all week." He sat down at the table with his family, in the house on the rise above the creek on the good Kansas land, with the September evening going gold outside and everything he had ever needed gathered around him, and the feeling in his chest was not relief, just as she had said it wouldn't be. It was something considerably better than relief. It was home.